Did you know that in 1991 this country declared itself the last fortress of communism? Well, today we're going to make a video about the history of Belarus. It was a cold December day in 1991 when the leaders of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus met up in a small village called Belarus. Well, it just so happened that it was close to the private residence of Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev. He had invited the other two leaders to come over for a hunting trip. However, many have speculated that the choice of location was no coincidence. And Ukraine instead of the Baltic states? Well, that actually wasn't the case. But before that, the western half of the country had been under the control of Poland. When World War II began, Germany invaded and occupied both Belarusian territories. After the war, as I mentioned earlier, the western border between Poland and Lithuania was re-established. You see, even though the country still identifies as communist, and even though it still has a population of ethnic Russians who might be sympathetic to that ideology, whether it's because they re-nostalgic for the Soviet Union, or because they just do UN-like change. The reality is that Belarus is a thoroughly modern state. It has a stock exchange, it has private companies, it has everything that a normal capitalist country would have, except for maybe a McDonald's, although they do have a McDonald's in the capital city of Minsk. But this meant that about 2/3 of the people who identified as Belarusians were now living within the borders of the Soviet Union, while only about 1/3 of them lived in the newly independent Polish People's Republic. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. You see, while most of the other Soviet republics were able to declare their independence and then set about building a new democratic society based on free market principles, Belarus refused to do that. Instead, it clung to communism. Even though communism had been universally panned by every single reputable economist as being a terrible way to organize a society, this is the only reason why Belarus is still around today. It's not because they have some sort of special cultural or historical significance. No, it's purely for geopolitical reasons. By inviting the leaders away from prying eyes and ears, it was much easier for them to come to an agreement without any interference from the media. They were there to sign the Belarus Accords, an agreement which would dissolve the Soviet Union and create 3 separate states out of its western regions. So in order to prevent that, they made a deal with Poland. In exchange for giving up their territorial claims on the eastern 2/3 of Belarus, the Poles were allowed to resettle within the Soviet Union. This meant that the vast majority of ethnic Belarusians were now living within the borders of the Belarusian SSR. This prevented any large-scale nationalist movements from taking hold and kept the country firmly within the Soviet sphere. Well, that's because over the preceding months, many of the Soviet republics had already declared their independence. And so it was clear that the Soviet Union could not be kept together by force. On December, the Russian SFSR, the Ukrainian SSR, and the Belarusian SSR signed the Belarus Accords, which officially dissolved the Soviet Union and replaced it with 3 separate states: the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Belarus. The treaty also provided for the creation of a new supranational union called the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was initially composed of these 3 states and later expanded to include all of the former Soviet republics except for the Baltic states. The treaty has been named after the location where it was signed, but is also sometimes referred to as the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Cooperation, or the Treaty of Unity. The treaty was actually inspired by another treaty signed in the same place almost 200 years before, which had established the modern borders between Poland and Lithuania. Now, why did they choose this secluded village to meet up? But why did they agree to disband the Soviet Union? Now, while it may seem like Belarus got a raw deal by being grouped together with Russia, you see, after World War II, the region that we now call Belarus was incorporated into the Soviet Union as the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, this was a huge problem for the Soviets, because they didn't want all of those Belarusian nationalists to start agitating for independence. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, this meant that Belarus had a much larger population of ethnic Belarusians than Poland, which is why it was able to survive as an independent state. Now, I should point out that while Belarus is often described as the last communist state, that isn't entirely accurate. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video about the history of Belarus.